You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckford, and my father, Jake. We're doing this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there. We're releasing all of these for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jake. Jay, how about you?
I'm doing pretty well. I think tonight's going to be a really interesting episode. It's a very good episode. We are reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 23, Sarek, named after the star character of this tale. And this debuted on March 14th, 1990, with a star date of 43917.4. Before we really get started, what do you think of this episode, and just your initial comments? Because I think we have a lot of interesting places to go and some very cool things to talk about from a world-building side.
Well, first of all, the one comment is I think Mark Lenard, who's the actor that plays Sarek,
Yes.
has consistently been. Does he go back to the original series? Was he Sarek
Yes.
in the original series? So I think
Yes,
it's
he
really
was.
good that they were able to. The producers of Star Trek were able to maintain a relationship with Sarek over many, many years, so they had that consistency in terms of Spock's father.
Well, if I may jump in real quick, one reason they were able to have access to him is because around the same time, the original crews are filming the Paramount films. So, like, next year, he's going to appear. He's going to appear in season 4 during the episode. It may be season 5, but the episode Unification.
Mm-hmm.
And a month after he appears in that episode, Star Trek 6 is going to come out.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
Or he's going to. Yeah, I think he appears a month later in, like, Star Trek 6 when that comes out with the original crew.
Right.
So, they had access to him at this time. But I'm sorry, go on.
No, that's all. That's the only comment I wanted to make at this point.
Okay. Well, I agree with you. I think it's really good that the producers of the show, and I think Gene Roddenberry himself, really went out of their way to make sure that they maintained at least a world building continuity for the most part. And even going back to the second episode of the first series, The Naked Now, they were referencing the original crew and their adventures, going all the way back to then. So it's actually good to start seeing characters appear. I think he is the first character that we've seen from the major films or the original series to actually show up, except for DeForest Kelley. DeForest Kelley showed up in the very first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
That's right.
Walking down the corridor with Data.
Yes.
But to my knowledge, I don't think there's another original series character that appears this way.
Right.
One thing that I should note before we continue, the teleplay for this episode in the story was written by Peter S. Beagle, who is a fantasy author who is very famous for The Last Unicorn, which is a very popular novel. And this was also directed by Les Landau, who is a very popular and very prolific director within Star Trek, but also in general television. So there's a lot of things that were going for this show in 1990, and one of the main writers, Michael Piller, actually thinks that this is a really great episode because it deals with something I think that we're going to really delve into. The first thing, kind of mental illness and kind of what happens when our elders actually start dealing with frailty in their later years. But to get there, let's dig into the episode real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
So, Ambassador Sarek of Vulcan is called aboard the USS Enterprise D to fulfill one last diplomatic mission, a treaty with a mysterious race known as the Ligarans. We open the episode with Captain Picard and Commander Riker walking down the corridor in their dress uniforms on their way to meet the ambassador. Picard has a very interesting dialogue here with Riker, I think, where they both kind of talk about the legendary status uh, of Sarek, even with Picard going as far to mention that he once met Sarek at his son's wedding. Now, we know that Sarek had two sons. He had Spock, and I forget what the other half Vulcan's name is in the fifth film, the one where Kirk faces off against God. Remember him?
Oh, yeah, that's
He
right.
was.
I don't
Um,
remember. Yeah.
I don't remember his name, but I think to answer your question, because you asked at one point, Picard mentions he met Sarek at his son's
His
wedding. Did
son's wedding.
Spock get married? So, according to lore, and I had looked this up on Memory Alpha, Spock actually marries Saavik. Do you remember that character from the
Oh, yeah.
films?
Yeah, sure.
She was first played by Christy Alley, and then I
Yeah,
forget
yeah.
who the second actress played, and then they got
Right,
Kim Cattrall to play a completely new character in the sixth one, which
right.
was supposed to be Saavik.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I think the general idea is that Spock does get married later on. But the interesting thing here is that when Sarek transports aboard, he is accompanied by three people. The first two to enter the transporter room and beam aboard before him are Kieman Drozen, who I think is a human. I'm not sure. And then Saketh, who is his Vulcan assistant, and I guess I guess attendant. And then
Hmm.
finally, Sarek beams aboard with his second human wife, Perrin. And I think this is interesting because, Sarek is a legendary figure in the fact that he's not only this diplomat with a large and storied career that has almost shaped the Federation itself, especially when they mention the Cordion Alliance and I think the Klingon Alliance and then the admission of the Corridons.
Hmm.
But we have seen, which I had to look up what the emission of the Corridons was. That's actually a that is actually a throwback to. I wanted to see continuity. Oh yeah, it was revealed that in this episode that Corridon successfully joined the Federation after the events of the original series episode Journey to Babel, in large part to Ambassador Sarek's support. So not only is this bringing on a character, but they're also mentioning stuff that maybe the audience isn't aware of in terms of world building history in the
Hmm.
background.
Right.
To I can't remember the Journey to Babel episode very well. Actually, I do remember the Journey to Babel episode. That's the
Yeah,
one where Sarek is introduced.
and that was an original series, right?
Yeah, that's the one where
Yeah, I
Spock
remember
and
because there was
yeah,
somebody trying to kill one of the ambassadors, and it was a Tellarite or something that was
yes,
surgically altered
yes,
as an Andorian.
exactly. Yes, I remember this now. Yeah,
Yeah,
because that's when that's back when the Andorians had those really big antennas and they were
yeah,
almost white. They
yeah.
weren't blue like they were in
Right.
Enterprise.
And I remember there was a ship that tried to, but was very fast and weapons that tried to destroy the Enterprise, and they ended up tricking it because Kirk shut the power down. And they were adrift and brought them
Right.
in, and then he destroyed them when they had their shields down. And they figured out that it was after the ship was damaged, the crew of this ship just destroyed themselves because they were a one-way mission.
Right.
They were
And I
like
think that's also
space kamikazes.
I think that was also the first episode where they introduced the idea that Sarek did not like Spock joining the Federation.
Right, right.
Because I think there's always been this. There was always in-world expectation that Spock was either going to join the Vulcan Science Academy or
Yes, right.
just be part of the Vulcan culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I think one thing that I want to mention from like a real-world aspect of all this, I find it interesting that even in the 24th century, we are still kind of using an ambassador, a third party ambassador system in a way, where you have these figures that are, Sarek is definitely part of Vulcan. He's definitely a big member of the Federation, but he's not especially bound to a hierarchy. It seems.
Hmm.
Seems like Sarek gets to do whatever Sarek wants to do in many
Hmm.
cases, and like
Hmm.
he pursues his own course. Um, you know, it seems to me in most cases today that most ambassadors are usually part of a government or they are working directly for an organization. It seems that Sarek here does not have to have that kind of worry. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or just like the general kind of station they give him.
Um, no real comments. I mean, in some ways, it makes sense that just for this. I mean, just not from. I guess what you're throwing out there is that would there be a necessity to have ambassadors in the 24th century between different planets and different species and cultures? And yeah, probably. And I think it just makes the story go well too.
No, I think I do expect in the 24th century there to be ambassadors and everything. I would just think that they would be like Starfleet officers, or like you would have someone already on the ship that like you wouldn't necessarily send Sarek at the end of his 93-year career. You would probably send someone who is actually embedded deeper into the hierarchy of the Federation,
Well,
and someone recent too.
well, that's a good point. And you've had situations where Picard has been called on, in essence, to be
Right.
a dip, dip, diplomat as the commanding officer.
Well, so that's a good springboard back into the episode and kind of progressing it to
Sure.
where
Right.
it goes. One thing that they immediately notice when Sarek becomes aboard is that he is highly emotional. So he is putting together this conference with the Lagarans of Lagara 4. And they are going to be, and he asks immediately to be brought to this meeting room where he will be having the conference with them, where Geordie LaForge and Wesley Crusher, I think, are hard at work trying to get it prepared. Um, the interesting thing about this is that we never actually see the Lagarans, so we only really have context clues about who they are. And, the show presents us with a lot of interesting ideas in the quote unquote field of exobiology. Um, I think it's very interesting that the Lagarans are leaving. Somehow they're going to be beamed aboard from whatever liquid that they live in. It seemed like some sort of slime, but
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, they live in some sort of warm goo, it seems.
let's say for a second it's water, and like play that out for a second. Like
Sure.
take the goo aspect. So I think it was season one. It was season one because it's the first one where Luxana comes on, and
Oh,
she identifies those two aquatic aliens as assassins going
assassins.
to
Right.
a
Right.
right. Um, those creatures, the aquatic assassins from season one, were beamed on in stasis, and then woke up and had to eat kind of like a minnow grub thing that was kept for them in
Hmm.
sickbay.
Hmm.
Um, those creatures, foreseeably, while still having gills and everything, could leave water, essentially. It seems like the Lagarans can't do that. So they've constructed this pool for the Lagarans, and I guess the idea is that they're going to beam the Lagarans off the surface or out of whatever medium that they exist in into this medium, and then Sarek is going to sit at a conference table, or they're going to crawl out of the conference table and sit with him. And the point I'm getting to with all this is that I know we're doing this for story conceit, and they have to keep the production down a little bit in terms of how many sets they use. But I think in a real world story setting, if I were to write this or another sci-fi writer were to write this today, I think Sarek would be going down, don't you think? Like you would
Well,
have going down to the surface to meet the Lagarans in like their natural habitat. It seems like it's a really big ask for you to take a race of species out of their natural environment, place them on a starship for a diplomatic thing, when like apparently they've been mysterious and untrusting for a long time and will only talk to Sarek.
well,
Um,
that's a good point because I'm thinking this probably story was written after this long after this episode of Next Generation, but in like season 3 or 4 of Enterprise, when
right,
they're dealing with the Zindi, who are a group that are
right.
multiple species, or they have different strains of the species. They have the
Mm-hmm.
aquatics that were in a they were in a big aquarium where they lived, and they made noises, but I've never understood how they understood the noises that the aquatics made. But um, I guess thing in
The
just
vaunted universal translator.
right, yeah, yes. But I think one of the things, getting back to the practicality of the story, since one of the things we'll get into is Sarak's lack of emotional control and how
Mm-hmm.
that tied in with his telepathic powers. They sort of had to have Sarak and the whole diplomatic transaction take place on the Enterprise so they could throw in the component of how Sarak's telepathic
Mm-hmm.
emotionality was affecting the crew.
Of course, I mean you need that conceit, but
Right.
I think like if this was written from a very
I
by
see
the
your
book
point.
perspective,
Sure,
yeah.
I see your point. Yeah.
Well, like it's kind of like why would you have third party ambassadors when you can just have someone who's like directly tied into the
Right.
Federation?
Right.
Would it like we don't meet in if Americans want let me put it this way, if Americans want to talk to Koreans, we don't suddenly meet in Geneva. Like they either come to DC or we go directly to Seoul.
No,
Um,
it's like today. Vladimir Putin and Joe
or
Biden have a Zoom meeting, and Biden is in his house in Wilmington, Delaware.
I, Dad, I have so many things I want to say about that, and I'm just gonna leave it alone. Um, you know what? Fuck it, we're here. Um, it seems very odd. Well, do you know what? Let's use this as a real world example. In a time of like, and we've seen in Star Trek like them deal with pandemics and disease and the worry about cross contamination. And here we are in 2021, and two of the most powerful world leaders, who are potentially foes with each other, are having a Zoom meeting, just like we are recording this podcast in a way, though we're using Zencaster, who hopefully will pay us something down the road. Um, but, isn't that just such a strange thing to be where we are? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but growing up, it really was a big deal for leaders to go places and meet other leaders. And it
Yeah.
seemed like growing up in your era that became something much more prevalent and much more
Oh, yeah.
important.
No, I think it's most beneficial is if you can have um, parties in serious negotiations, particularly when they're adversarial and they're focused on maintaining peaceful relations rather than hostilities or war. That the face to face can be, very important. Um, things such as Roosevelt and Churchill meeting before World War II and during
Mm-hmm.
World War II, and having, the Yalta meeting and, um, Potsdam and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing, the good example was Jimmy Carter with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. Because if you really get
Mm-hmm.
into the story of Carter, really, everybody thinks he's a gentleman, but he really put a lot of pressure on those two men to come to an agreement.
Right.
But now, because of the pandemic we're in and, the timeliness of trying to have discussions at the right time to prevent a diplomatic situation or a geopolitical situation becoming, getting into war. I think there's, because of the pandemic and the need for virtual communications, it has made this much more acceptable now. And I think that, I'm sure that the quality of the communication between Biden and Putin was very good, and their translators were professionals. We know that Putin speaks English pretty well anyway, that it would be a good exchange, not good as being in person, but not too far below it. The other thing I want to say in relation to this, and I think this is a generational thing, there's a tendency for younger people, when they want to negotiate or they're having personal problems, that they will default to email or text. And that is just completely fucked up and wrong and stupid, because
in your opinion,
in my opinion, I think that when you have a problem you want to talk through, email or text is not the way to do it.
I will say this and both defending my generation and like responding to you in a way that's not dismissing what you say, because I don't necessarily disagree with you fully. I think social media and cell phone and smartphones in general have really depersonalized us. I don't think it's just email and text. I think it's the device themselves and the availability of it.
I actually concur. That's probably the primary issue here.
Well, like one thing that I don't think people really take into account, because right now, you and I are using the cameras to look at each other face to face, but there's an option here on Zencaster where I can turn off the cameras and we can only hear our voices. And
Sure.
that leads to a new level of anonymity between us, where if you can't see my face, you don't really know what I'm thinking, in connection to the words that I'm saying. And you might be one of the unfortunate people who can't read faces. Um, but one thing that I think that has happened because of the internet, and I know we're getting off the conversation about the episode, but this is important. I think one thing that has happened about the internet and one thing that has happened with social media is that my generation has this expectation to be performative in a way that it's not just we have to document everything that we do, we also have to use it to show something of value. So, in some cases, and I think I know what you're referring to, I think when people get into conflict, one thing that American culture, and I think Western culture is kind of bred in all of us, is a certain level of like faux litigiousness that if we capture ourselves saying horrible things to each other through email and text, and we can catch each other like causing each other to be mean to each other, we will somehow make one person say something worse than the other, and that will give us each the moment to go, aha, look at how awful this person is versus me, even though that person could easily turn around and go, well, wait a second, you said this to cause me to do that, or a whole host of things. But the problem is email and text makes all of those things static, and it's kind of like snapshots instead of a moving picture. Um, I'm a really big fan of Plato's Cave because it's a parable about perception. Even though I think there's one really big flaw to it that no one ever really wants to address, but that's something else. Um, Plato's Cave is very good because it really does deal with the question of like, okay, from your vantage point, how much information are you really taking in to create a full picture? Um, in some ways, social media and the internet allow us to take a more detailed and fuller picture than ever before. But the way we use it, it's cobbling together scraps of different pictures and expecting you to make sense of a collage. But it's a collage, and there's too many things going on.
And
So,
that sounds like it's subject to interpretation.
yes. Well, it's not only subject to interpretation, there's also this And getting back to the episode, there's also this huge emotional pull behind it. Like, we have memeified our emotions, and that's
Mm-hmm.
a really important term, meme. Um, a meme is, and there's an actual definition to it, so I want to make sure I get the definition. But a meme is a noun or an element of culture or system of behavior that may be considered to be passed from one individual to another by non-genetic means, especially imitation. Also, a humorous image, video, piece of text that is copied, often with slight variation, and spread rapidly by internet users. The thing is, these memes have come to capture such large parts of the modern psyche, especially of my generation, that in many ways memes have become their own language and shorthand to mean certain things. Now, the problem is we don't have really good memes for interpersonal conflict. So when it comes to actual interpersonal conflict, we get on email and we get on text because not only does it allow a certain level of anonymity to where people can, it's weird. People have a level of anonymity where they're able to be honest with each other, but it also breeds them to be meaner to each other. Because
Yes.
if you had to say things face to face, you can't say some of the things you say face to face without having to deal with the real repercussions of that person physically being there.
Right. And you astutely uh, surmised is the specific situation of which we're talking about, and we don't need to go into
Well,
the details. Right.
like it's getting back to the Lagarans and Sarek. And kind of getting back to the pandemic in 2021, I think the one of the things that makes the show look like it was made in 1990 is the fact that, like, if you think from a technological aspect about what is possible in the 24th century from a Star Trek perspective, you could send a hologram of Sarek down to the Lagarans to meet with them there and converse. You don't actually have to send him physically. And especially if you live in a universe where the crew of the Enterprise is always going to places where they're picking up or they're having to deal with pandemics or disasters and stuff like that, I wouldn't want to subject a 202-year-old Vulcan necessarily to the possibility of exposure to something like this. And, if we've never seen the Lagarans before, or they're very rare in terms of contact we have with them, and Sarek's the only person they talk to, I think in the future it would be doubly important to to protect him as much as possible. Um, but getting back to the episode, because I know we went a long way, they immediately start noticing that something's wrong. Um, he immediately goes to the meeting room and he shows that his emotions off by complaining about the lights, the decoration, everything. And it causes a stir because it really, his wife Perrin tries to calm him down, his aides try to calm him down. Picard and Riker both assure him that everything will be up to the specifications. But even as he's leaving, there's this kind of lack of control to him.
Yeah, well, and then the other thing is that when even before Sarek beams onto the Enterprise, um, Mendrosin and Saketh want to get him to his quarters quickly because they want to keep. They know that they have some sense of what the problem he's having and so forth, and they
Mm.
want to isolate him so people can't see that he's under emotional duress.
Well, they originally tried to play it off as like, Sarek is an old man at
And he's
202
tired
years
and needs
old.
rest. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, like a 93-year career, um, a century of serving something, and then like this is supposed to be the cap to all of his accomplishments, his final hurrah.
And
Um,
then what really shows it is when Picard invites Perrin to come to the Mozart concert, and
right.
Sarek decides to attend, and he is seeing tears streaming down his face, so that he and Sarek realizes what's happening, and he leaves. And a number of
Right.
people notice that, including Troy.
Well, I think it's such a powerful scene, and also a very interesting scene. But we'll get into Sarek's part of it first. Um, the Vulcans go through this ritual multiple times through their life called the Kolinar. And one thing there's two things about Sarek we're going to talk about tonight, you and I, from now on, since we got past our memification talk. The first one is when the elderly finally grow old, and one of the things that can happen is mental infirmities, and we're also dealing with this right now in our family. And Ben, if you're listening to this is 2021. I don't know when you're going to listen to this, but your Uncle Dave, unfortunately, is suffering from Alzheimer's, or it may be Alzheimer's. The truth is, we don't really know until after death, and they're able to biopsy the brain. But there's a good chance that he has Alzheimer's, and that is unfortunately a neurological disease that slowly steals the memory, the ability to form short and long-term memory within elderly people, and it's a terrible, terrible thing to die of. And unfortunately, Uncle Dave, who we love very much and loved you very much, is suffering from that. And when our elderly reach this point, um, it's a very difficult reminder of our mortality. And it's also a very awkward moment because I think we all want to maintain our own sense of dignity, but we also want to, and I think what Sakith and Keeman Drozen and Parent are trying to do is maintain another person's dignity. And when going through that difficult process, mistakes are often made, and people have different ideas of what a person's dignity is, and sometimes even the person who's suffering doesn't know what's going on completely. Um, and before I keep going and prattling on about this kind of deep emotional subject, um, Dad, do you have any when you see Sarek at the end of his life, struggling with mental illness. And like you mentioned, we will later come to find out he is struggling with Bendii Syndrome, which even Michael, even oh, what's the actor's name? Because he even in a 1994 interview, Mark Lenard noted the script dealt with a Vulcan with a very rare disease, kind of a version of Alzheimer's. I knew something about that. We used to call it senility when I was a kid. So then he goes on and talks about how he acted for Sarek by saying he didn't do much; he just reacted to things. But when you see Sarek, an older person, struggling with mental health after they've had a long, long and successful career, and just watching how everyone reacts to him and how everyone's kind of both hovering around him, but at the same time making decisions for him, but trying to maintain his ability to have his own agency. What are your thoughts on it? Because I had my own thoughts and observations on it, but I just want to hear what you think. Because it really is a human thing that we're watching happen, and it's just such a hard struggle.
Well, one of the things we wanted to talk about is it's a little world building in terms of Vulcan society, Vulcan psychology. That you mentioned the uh, uh,
Kolinar.
Kolinar process, where it's a way that Vulcans go through a process of meditation and self examination so that they really suppress their emotions. And one of the things that comes out here and in other episodes is that the level of emotionality that Vulcans have is actually much greater than humans.
Mm-hmm.
And in their past, they were dealt with violence and war and
Mm-hmm.
that in some ways much worse than humans, so that they had to develop this discipline so they could suppress their emotions. And I think Kolinar, you had mentioned that Vulcans can go through it more than once, or they just basically go through it once at some point in their
They can go.
life?
I know Spock went through it like twice.
Okay.
Because
So,
Spock, if I may,
yeah.
he is recorded as going through the Kolinar before the motion picture, and then I think he went through the Kolinar again.
And the other thing that's related to this in terms of Vulcan psychology is,
Mm-hmm.
They have the ability to do the mind meld, but there seems to be some sort of telepathic capability,
Mm-hmm.
because part of the
Yes.
Bendii Syndrome problem is that once Sarek cannot suppress these very intense emotions, that it's having an effect on the crew. It starts
So
with
Vulcans are
Wesley, and
telepathic.
talk to me a little bit, because I didn't realize that Vulcans were actually telepathic.
So some Vulcans have very.
Or is the telepathy actually a symptom of the Bendii syndrome?
So some Vulcans can develop highly developed states of telepathy. Not to the level of like a Beta Z who can basically read you, because we've seen Tam Eldrin now, and Tam
Right,
Eldrin can read your
right,
exact thoughts.
right.
Um, and we kind of have a blunted version of it with Troy, who can read your emotional states, but Vulcans can, in some cases, can actually read thoughts. And there's places in the original series where Spock said that he was able to read thoughts, and it's more of like an emotional reflection. It may be more empathic than anything. They've never really nailed down what it means for them to, what telepathy means for a Vulcan
Well,
versus being empathic like Troy is.
and again, something I just learned, a thought I had, is that, again, the enhanced telepathy, particularly the ability to project the
Mm-hmm.
disturbed emotional state, may be a symptom, a side effect of the Bendii syndrome. Because something I learned the other day is, since I've been dealing with tinnitus for over a month now, is that if somebody is in a state of anxiety, that alone can cause
Mm-hmm.
tinnitus.
Oh
So
yeah.
again, if you have something changes in your brain chemistry, your brain physiology, and so forth, this, what I have is this, low level projection of sound somewhere in my brain that, is not normal.
Yeah. Well, I think the I think when it comes to Vulcans, as you noted, they went through this very hard history of being grossly emotional creatures to the point that they destroyed their civilization and had to take another 1,000 years before they were
Mm-hmm.
spacefaring again. Um, versus us humans, that we had World War III, and then about 20 years later, after Zefram Cochrane meets the Vulcans, we're having the first warp jumps. I mean, we're having the first Enterprise go out on its journey. Not uh, it wasn't 20 years. I think it was like 75 or something. Like the
It was
Vulcans held them for a while.
2063 to 2151 or something like that.
Yes, you're right. God, you're good with those dates. Yeah, but yeah, 2151. I think you're right. Um, so I think the idea that the Vulcans have always had, that they're able to, and this is a quote that I've checked multiple places. The Kolinar helps them rid themselves of their emotions. Now, the idea of ridding yourself of emotions is interesting, because for a Vulcan, that means in their mind that they don't have them. But but
Go
at the
ahead.
same time, they acknowledge that they do, and that they're always working to keep them under control.
Yeah, I don't think they lose their emotions, as you say. I think that they really
No, no. The Kolinar says explicitly that like you rid yourself of your emotions.
but practically, does that mean that they no longer have emotions, or are they just somehow suppressed? They're controlled, because
Dad,
this
can
is
I
what
tell you
Ben.
what that practically actually means?
Go ahead.
It means the Vulcans are full of shit.
Well, yes, exactly, because they're basically
Yeah,
lying to themselves.
yeah. Oh well. it gets into a question of like, really, how does society make itself do the things that it ends up doing? I think to a certain extent, we as a society have to lie to ourselves about certain things to make
Yes.
ourselves function. Like,
Yes.
we have to lie to ourselves with the idea that like, if we all don't wear our seatbelts when we get into the car and we get into a car wreck, it's going to be 1,000 times worse. Even though there's not necessarily evidence that, if you're not wearing your seat, well, there is the problem is the windshield. Like, you actually need the seatbelt so you don't go flying into a windshield.
Let me tell you, going back to the 50s before seatbelts, and when
Oh
cars
yeah,
had naugahyde seats, faux leather seats, and you go
yeah.
around a turn, you actually had to hold on to things so that you didn't
Mm-hmm.
slide around on the seat.
Oh yeah, terrifying.
Honestly, yeah, it was. It
No,
could be. Yeah.
but the point I'm getting to is that like we create all these cultural constructions for us to function as a normal society and agree that we're not going to be killing each other or going crazy, murder, rape, and steal. Um, One of the cultural conceits that the Vulcans have agreed to is that emotions are bad, and it has led to like a semi-successful. It's almost like a question of the Klingons and their honor. Is their society still successful if they are slowly torturing themselves in a way that leads to something like the Bendii Syndrome, which, it should be noted that when Beverly Crusher starts looking into it and she consults the Vulcan medical database, they don't have any information on it. Not, and just like I just watched an episode with Ben where Worf becomes a paraplegic and
Mm.
wants to take his own life, and like she's looking into the Klingon medical database, and every time she talks to a Klingon doctor, they're like, "Well, we would have let him die by now. Like, why are you trying to heal him? Like his life is over." But like, and even Worf's head, like he's like, "My life is over. I have no legs." The idea that we have no emotions is a cultural construct that's just there for their benefit and their benefit alone. Because the truth is, if you watch Vulcans in every episode, even Spock, like Spock is full of emotions. They're full of mirth. They're kind
Hmm.
of wry. They're very arrogant. Like if we're really honest about Vulcans, they're incredibly arrogant for who they are and what they do in the galaxy. No offense to the Vulcans, but like they're kind of third in line, it seems, in terms of this partnership. It seems like the Federation has the numbers and the Andorians have the weapons. The Vulcans might have the mind, but it seems like they need the other two to kind of make things happen. Um, but I think the big cultural thing here, and this is going to get into a larger conversation about mental illness, and getting back to my initial question that I was asking you, when you're seeing them kind of hover around this issue and hover around Sarek, um, from where you are and how you grew up and your place in society, how does it make you feel and how do you perceive it?
Oh, I think that the way that they portray how Madrosian and Saketh try to protect Sarek and Perrin, and how actually it's finally revealed that Saketh actually works through his telepathic power to help Sarek maintain control of his emotions,
Right.
diminish the symptoms of the Bendii syndrome. I think you have situations where in organizations and companies and so forth where somebody has been very successful, they're a very respected leader, thought leader, and so forth, and they get older, and at some point, they start to become their ability to remember things and to make cogent decisions about things starts to diminish. And people that work with them will start to notice that. So there's a dynamic where, out of respect, they'll try to, the supporters will try to compensate for that
Mm-hmm.
person's, loss of ability to communicate, to make decisions and so forth. But it gets to a point where they realize that, somebody needs to talk to this person, whether it's a man or a woman, and say, look, you're really having a deficit in some areas. Do you understand this? And maybe you need to retire. You need to do something different. You need to take lesser responsibilities. So I think the dynamic is when younger people see an older person start to diminish in this way, they may try to support that person to kind of compensate out of respect for that person. But there comes a point where there has to be some discussion with that person that, do you know that this is going on and it's having an
Yeah.
effect on you and your relationship to others?
Right. And that's such a delicate balance to have,
It
especially
is. It is
when,
a balance, right?
well, I think the hard part about it is that when you finally have to acknowledge these things, we're ultimately always acknowledging that our mortality in a way. That, like, one of the reasons Sarek is going through Bendii Syndrome, and this is just the hard truth, he's old. Like, he's old. And there's
Yeah.
no other reason for him to have Bendii Syndrome other than the fact that he's old. And I think that for a lot of people, when they have to, I think with Sackett struggling with it, Kemandroza, and even Perrin struggling with it, um, I think it all hints back to this idea that, like, we have an end date, and we always want to think that that end date's off and that we have more time in our lives to do the things we want. But then things like this hit, and Dad, I remember when Granddaddy died, and thinking, like, before his triple bypass, and like immediately after, we had more time. And then you suddenly don't have that time. And I just want to ask you, like, if for someone of your generation, when it came to things like mental health or seeing people struggle with this, how would you like to have it handled if you had to go through something like this? Because I think it's such an easy thing to say, like, oh, we're going to be there and care for you, or oh, someone is going to be there to take care. But the idea, one person's idea of, like, taking care of another person may be that person's idea of torture. And, in some ways, even Sarek expresses in this episode how much he doesn't like being minded over, even though he desperately needs to be minded over, clearly, because, his his telepathic abilities are having real consequences. Just how do you think how would you want this handled? Because I kept sitting here watching the episode, wondering, like, okay, if I'm Sarek, how do I want someone to approach me with this? And I was just kind
I,
of
I,
dumbfounded a little bit.
we could do a whole nother podcast on this whole question, but I think that one, um, there's been a change where there's better recognition of mental deterioration, mental health issues in the elderly. And that goes hand in hand with better acknowledgement and acceptance that it is very common for people in society, regardless of their age, even getting down into, particularly in teenage years, in pre adolescence, even, that there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of mental illness, a lot of
Oh
people who
yeah,
need mental health, and that we have a mental health system in this country that just sucks out the ass right now.
terrible.
And I don't see, with what's going on with priorities the way they are, that it's going to get better anytime soon. But from a personal basis, I think that if I uh, were to start to mentally deteriorate and I would not be able to acknowledge for some reason that were occurring, I would want somebody to point it out. I mean, I can tell you right now that just in the last several years, when I think of a name, you know, some historical fact, it is harder sometimes to pull it up.
Hmm.
I'll think about it. I said it's on the tip of my tongue, tip of my brain, and
Hmm.
it might take 10 minutes before it pops up in my head.
Right. Well, that I can tell you, going, I'm 35 now, going to be 36 in February. That's starting to happen to me too a little bit.
Hmm.
And Eve, I think the thing that I think you pointing out the mental part is interesting, because I think now getting into the only way I can really relate to that really is into my 30s. I'm starting to feel myself physically deteriorate a little bit. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not. I don't think I'm like falling apart, but I can
Hmm.
tell like I'm finally starting to get older, and
Hmm.
like I'm not as strong as I used to be, and I'm not as
Hmm.
fast as I used to be, and like
Hmm.
that's just part of it. It's like nothing's
Hmm.
wrong. It's just this is what happens when you start getting to
Right.
this age.
Right.
So I understand where you come from this from the perspective that you want someone to be honest with you. Um, I think one of the reasons why Perrin and Mendrosen and Saketh aren't able to be honest with Sarek is because of the certain level of his legend,
Hmm.
and I think there's also the discomfort of having to, you say, I think you and I have the relationship where I would probably be the one, be like, Dad, something's really wrong, and you would listen to me, but we have that relationship where we can do that. It seems to me Sarek does not have those kind of relationships whatsoever, even with like his wife, where his wife is not able to stand back and say like, Sarek, you really need to pay attention to this, because she's trying to keep the perception of him going as well and protect his image.
And that I'll bring back to the happening in the episode is that one of the things that helps us understand how um, strong the Vulcan emotional states are is after the discussion takes place with Sarek and he acknowledges that he has the Bendii Syndrome. And then to
Hmm.
get
In
through
a beautiful confrontation between
yes,
Patrick Stewart and
yes. And
yeah.
and at that point, Sarek asks Picard to mind meld with him so that he can use, instead of using Saketh, he wants to use Picard as his emotional backstop, so that when their minds meld, it's like Sarek can project all of the emotional instability onto Picard, and he can keep his mind, calm in his negotiations with the Ligarans. And
Can
and
I say
that,
something about that real quick
yeah, go ahead.
that I find interesting about that entire thing? So there's a bunch of clues that I noticed leading up to that on my third watch through today. Because I'm getting to the point now where I watch these 3 times in preparation. Um, Perrin notes to Picard at one point that Sarek has taken note of Picard's career, both as a captain and ambassador, and finds it satisfactory, which Picard notes for a Vulcan is a high compliment, which it
Right,
really is.
right.
Like, Sarek might as well have come out and said, like, you're great. You're the best captain. You're the best captain I've ever met, and I met Kirk. Um, like, he never said that about Kirk. Like, Kirk was satisfactory. He always said, like, Spock, I like your friends, but that's not the same thing. Um, there's an automatic expectation that, like, by Saketh and Keeman Drozen, and even Perrin to a certain extent, that, like, if Sarek's not going to be able to do this, we need to get this deal with Ligarans done, and we have Jean-Luc Picard here to do it. And, like, Saketh starts asking Data about that almost
Right,
immediately.
right, exactly.
So, like,
Mhm.
there's kind of this expectation that, like, okay, we brought Sarek here, but just in case, we have Jean-Luc Picard in the background, even though no one said anything to him about it. And then at one point, like, Sarek jumps to the idea of mind melding with Picard so quickly because he understands that Picard has such mental discipline and such emotional discipline, almost Vulcan-like in itself. Um, I think in some ways Sarek planned this. Because I think Sarek looked at the one person who's like, okay, I'm going to get on the Enterprise because it's Captain Jean-Luc Picard, and if in case I can't do this, he's going to do it. And I think that there's kind of been a plan in the background the entire episode that, like, okay, if
Makes
I don't
sense.
make this,
I don't.
yeah.
I don't disagree with that. Yeah.
Because they didn't just choose anybody, they chose the flagship. And the flagship's not run by just anyone, it's run by the
Right.
best captain in the fleet.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, it seems like a lot of effort went into make this meeting happen, but at the same time, when they finally get to the mind meld, um, there's a very interesting interplay where I don't know, it almost seems expected. And even Sarek, at one point, when he finally goes up to the bridge and lets Riker know he's ready for the Lagarans to come aboard, in a really great dialogue between Sarek and Riker as they're walking the corridor, and Sarek keeps calling Riker number one because he's really Jean-Luc Picard, and he even asks at that. Riker asks him at that point. He's like, "Well, is Jean-Luc Picard okay?" And he's like, "Of course he's okay, number one." He's like, "In the ambassador," and Sarek says, "Well, I'm me again for the first time, and it's been a
Right.
long time."
Well, because I noticed that because actually, when Riker was walking down the corridor, he was talking to both of them.
Yes, and I
Right.
think that that's a fascinating
That
thing from
is.
like
Yes.
a neurological
Yeah.
perspective, because
Yes.
we've always talked about mind melds and telepathies in terms of what the Vulcan can do, but now we have something functional we can talk about.
Let me ask you this. This is an aside. One of the questions I ask: do you
Oh,
think that
yeah.
is there any evidence that humans, our species now, that some people might have some sort of telepathic power, or if it's not telepathy as it's classically defined, are some people better at reading emotional states by their facial expression
Oh,
or even sensing of the emotional state of someone else?
so that's an interesting question. There's a lot of people who today believe they're empathic and they are able to sense the emotional states of people or the room that they're in. I think part of it is being able to just read the room, being able to take body language, see facial expressions, and also, you know what, I think when we're talking about things, I kind of put it in the perspective of data collection. If you're able to collect a lot of data and process it really quickly, you're able to figure out anything. And I think there's some people who are able to process the emotional signs that we give off that we might be unconscious of, but they somehow are conscious of them. I think it's the same way that, like, you have certain people who are really smart at baking or making sure the right measures of things. And I'm going to get back to hunter gatherers here, folks. People like Jay, where are you going with this? Just watch. Um, I think that this is actually an evolutionary thing, to be perfectly honest. I think there were some people that had better eyes, who had better attention to small movements in a larger environment. So they were able to look at a jungle forest and go, oh, there's a movement over there. That might be an animal. I can go kill that animal and eat it. Versus someone who's like, well, I have a good idea that this plant, from the way it looks, is probably poisonous, but this plant I can take and grow into something, and we can eat for three months off of it. Um, I think there is less telepathy than there is maybe a certain idea of prescience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, I've said in previous episodes I do actually believe in the metaphysical phenomena of magic with a K. Um, I don't believe in telepathy in terms of like someone can read my thoughts, or in terms of like I don't believe a human being can read another human being's thoughts. Now that leads into the question: well, Jay, do you believe that non-human things can read
Mm-hmm.
human thoughts? And we're not getting into that discussion tonight because that's another podcast. But I do believe that some people have the ability to be hyper observant in the moment, and it may seem like a form of telepathy in itself. But it's kind of like, did you ever see Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes?
No, I have not.
Okay, so in that show, Sherlock Holmes is hyper aware and hyper observant. Now, all that hyper observant doesn't mean anything if he doesn't have the ability to frame it. I think the people that we were talking about that are empathic are able to frame emotion in a way that's easily discernible and understandable for them. So there may not be telepathic, but these people who call themselves empathic are able to are just able to process the emotive component of humanity better than other humans are. But then, like, there's other humans out there who are geniuses when it comes to math or windsurfing. There's so many different things that we as a species can do, and I think
Well,
empathy or being empathic is part of an
so
evolutionary byproduct.
yeah, I understand that point. So if somebody,
It's not necessarily metaphysical or magical.
no,
To
so
sum it up.
if a human's empathic, so they can sense the mood, the emotional
Hmm.
state of others. This gets back to the episode that if some Vulcans can develop truly telepathic powers, it's not just that they can receive input to understand or sense what another is feeling, but in the case of Bendii syndrome, the mechanism reverses because what we see
Hmm.
of the, the all of the arguments that pop up on the Enterprise, starting with Geordi and Wesley, and that goes into Picard and Riker having an argument on the bridge, to the complete brouhaha on 10 forward and so forth.
May I comment on the brouhaha and 10
Just
forward?
let me
Yeah,
finish.
but let's
But
get.
that
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that the telepathy that Sarek as a Vulcan is demonstrating is not just that he can receive input, but because of his Bendii syndrome, he actually can project telepathically his emotions as well. I think that's a very interesting concept here.
Well, if you look at the function, it seems like telepathy becomes more of a conduit, where it's not a one way transfer of
Exactly.
things, but it's a
Exactly. Right.
constantly transfer. It's a constant exchange of, I guess, either mental or some sort of psychic energy that
So,
allows them to be connected despite being at a distance from each other. Because Picard's in a different room while Sarek's negotiating with Lagarin. So, like, the mechanism has to be able to work at a distance through matter and
and that's
still maintain its cohesion.
and that's a very good point because says, well, one step up is we have physical contact between a Vulcan and another Vulcan or another species, in this case a human, that then you have a complete exchange of thought.
Well, the interesting thing about all this, and it gets into your question about, like, do I think humans are telepathic? I don't think we are, but I think we could be. And and I think that we could, like, evolve into that eventually, because, like, if we look at it from a scientific perspective, the Vulcan telepathy is an evolutionary trait. Like, let's remove metaphysics, let's remove spirituality, let's keep this to science. Their telepathy, just like Troy's Beta Z
Well, I'm just going to say
empathic abilities.
that kind of evolution on Beta Z has occurred.
Well, the point I'm trying to get to here also is, you know, Spock is established to have some form of telepathy, but he's only half human. Where, Troy's half human, but she doesn't have Beta Z telepathy. She only has kind of an empathic power. Where Spock is half human, but he's able to actually develop and maintain a certain level of telepathy, which means, you know, they make a point in the show that, if species share similar genetic traits, there's a possibility of coming together to create an offspring. Um, if Vulcans are able to mate with humans and produce viable offspring, um, the genes in both sides have to be there to make certain things work. I think humans have the ability to one day be telepathic. Problem is, we have to, and this goes back to anything paranormal. You just have to find a way to scientifically prove it. And part of that problem, as we've discussed tonight, is how's the science around it framed? I don't think that we can actually have a good discussion about telepathy unless we actually sit here and do what you and I are doing. Like, we're talking about the mechanism of telepathy as it works on a scientific basis between a human and Vulcan. How would telepathy in the real world today work between humans? Like, how would we measure it? How would we be able to describe the mechanism that causes that measurable action to take place? Um,
We'll just
Science
have
doesn't want to do with that a lot of times because, like, addressing the metaphysical is automatically addressing the nebulous, and there's no end to the nebulous.
we'll just have to consult with the esteemed Columbia University professor Peter Venkman about this.
Exactly. Well, like, one thing that Venkman's doing, we joke about it, but at the very beginning of
Mm-hmm.
Ghostbusters, when he's having the
Mm-hmm.
students read and then
Mm-hmm.
he's shocking them,
Mm-hmm.
there is a metaphysical belief, especially in shamanism, that if you take on a physical or spiritual wound or take on physical trauma that produces a spiritual trauma, you can actually develop powers like empathic powers or telepathy or being able to leave your body to astrally travel, which may be in itself a form of telepathy. Um, the entire idea of pain causing humans to assume powers is actually an evolutionary response. Because let's look at what's happening. Like, Vakeman is causing pain, and the student is supposed to either develop a cognitive power to see what the card is on the other side or not. Versus the girl that he's flirting with who clearly can't see anything at all. But if what is evolution, Dad? It's us going through pain, enduring pain, and learning how to get through it, and developing tools along the way to basically negate it over time. Telepathy is probably one of those things that if Vulcans had to develop over time to negate certain challenges they were facing on their planet. Um, I think one thing that in getting telepathy, there's another science fiction universe that I've mentioned before called Gundam, Mobile Suit Gundam. And one thing that happens in Mobile Suit Gundam is that we start sending humans to these off-world colonies called sites.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that humans develop into these things called new types, and that's the next um, evolutionary step in the human race because we become a spacefaring race. And one of the things we develop is not only precognition, but we develop telepathy because we have to communicate with each other across vast distances in the stars. So one thing that might happen as we go into space is that the human psyche and the human brain actually changes and takes on new abilities. But of course, these are things that have to happen over millions, if not
Mm-hmm.
tens of millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just shock ourselves into being Superman tomorrow, unfortunately. If we could, we would be able to solve cancer and all sorts of diseases.
Sure.
We wouldn't
Y-
have to worry about
Yes.
things like Bendii Syndrome or Alzheimer's if we could do all that. I did want to. I first, did I answer your question well
Yes.
enough?
Yeah.
So I want to jump to the scene and tend forward before we deal with Picard and Sarek one last time.
Sure.
Um, as you know, I love fight scenes. I love when martial arts are shown in a very effective and good way. And despite people making fun of Star Trek because of what Kirk did fighting the Gorn, which people make fun of William Shatner, but that guy has a black belt in Aikido, and I would not fuck with him. But that fight in Ten Forward is amazing, and it took me 3 times really watching it to like really dive in and like break down everything that's going on. You have people fighting each other in a real, like, everyone in there is almost trained. If you look at the way they're fighting each other, they all have techniques that they're using. Like, at one point, one guy palm strikes Riker right in the
Mm-hmm.
face, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna use this example, and then we're gonna move on from this scene because there's so many great things. People throwing each other over tables, people tossing each other. There was one scene where one dude literally like hip tosses a dude onto a table, and he does it with this perfect judo throw, which I was like, that's right out of judo. But Riker tries to stop this guy from fighting, and this guy in this blue Starfleet uniform turns around and palm strikes him right in the nose, and Riker goes down like a heap of bricks. Everyone expects in a fight everyone to ball up their fists and start punching. Balling up your fists and punching in a real fight, like a real melee scuffle, not like a barroom brawl or something in the street, not like an organized sport fight. But balling up your fist is the dumbest thing you can do sometimes because people forget this thing is made out of small, fragile bones that if you hit it hard enough, this motherfucker shatters. And it hurts to high hell. Like, punching people is not something we're designed to do. But if you take your hand, if you bend it back as far as you can, and if you extend your hand out and you make this part of your palm right where it meets your wrist as hard as you can, and you stretch it back, this is one of the hardest hitting surfaces in the world. And there are so many techniques that you can use to disable and strike people. Like, you can knock people out hitting them with a palm strike. And it's delivered perfectly in that scene. And it just shows that, like, the writers and choreographers of the show have a sense in the future that, like, not only are Starfleet personnel trained in some sort of combat martial arts and able to defend themselves, but they have a sense of doing it in a smart way to like minimize injury, but also inflict the maximum amount of damage, which is really what you want to do in if you want to have a really effective martial art. You maximize damage, you maximize defense, and you minimize the damage you take.
Any fight or battle, you want to get it over with as quickly as possible, win it as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you watch that scene, you're watching a lot of people fighting each other using really effective techniques, trying to get it over as quickly as possible. But that's a great scene. I just wanted to touch on that real quick. Our final scene is going to be Jean-Luc Picard's emotional outpouring in his quarters. We talk about Patrick Stewart's Shakespeare background and how much of a brilliant actor he is. One of the most thrilling scenes I think in so far that we've seen in the entire show since we've been doing this podcast. I kind of want to end the episode just talking about how good of an actor Patrick Stewart is, and just the depth of the scene and what you notice from it, and just your opinion of it.
I thought it was very well played by Patrick Stewart. As I said before, one of the things he wanted to accomplish is to convey the depth and intensity of Vulcan emotions. And I think he did that.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought the other important point that I got was since it requested Beverly to be there to support him, it really, again, showed the deepening of the relationship between the two of them as friends, number one, but also that there's a really emotional attachment between the two of them.
I thought the symbolism in the scene was so important because on one hand, it's not only Beverly and Picard being there for each other as friends and then potentially, as romantic partners as they constantly hit throughout the show, but it's also a doctor there with her patient. And if you look at I want to read a very specific line, and I'm not going to scream at folks, but it's very loud, so I'm going to be loud for a part of it. But no! It is wrong. It is wrong. A lifetime of discipline washed away, and in its place, bedlam. Bedlam. And this is the part I want to highlight. I am so old. There is nothing left but dry bones. Dead friends. Oh, tired. Oh, so tired. Um, the way Beverly deals with that is I like the character of psychopomps, and for what people don't know, psychopomps are characters in mythology or fantasy that help transition souls from one plane of existence to another. And I really think that the conversation Picard has is almost the conversation that everyone has at the end of their life, and having a voice there to gently guide them to the next place or get them through it. And Picard has this soliloquy that I think captures so much of the pain and suffering that people feel when they realize that they're at the end of their life and they have so many regrets. And Beverly is that character that really does help him get through it. And I think, like, as important as Patrick Stewart is to that um, scene, and him saying Sarek's lines from revealing Sarek's inner turmoil, you can't have the scene without Gates McFadden there to anchor him and not only provide like comfort and companionship, but also provide a voice guiding the way out. She is really the one that guides him the way out of this. And I think it's more than just a romantic relationship. It's more than just friendship. And it's more than just storytelling. I think there's something very deeply spiritual and metaphysical going
Mm-hmm.
on here. That's
Mm-hmm.
something that we all want in a way. We all
Right.
want someone there when we're facing the fear and darkness of age
Right.
to tell us that, like, peace is coming and that you will make it through this, and that
Well,
this is
it's something not just with old age and death, but it's through any um,
right. Any
tra-
trauma.
any traumatic situation in life.
Well, one thing that I came across from this is, you know, they never give Spock and Sarek the peace of settling their differences. And I think it's brilliant character writing that, like, Sarek and his, you know, the thing that you have to worry about Vulcans is that they repress their emotions so much. Our emotions define us in a way and tells us who we are, but also tells others through our actions who we are. If Sarek didn't repress his emotions, you would find someone who is just so desperate to love his wife, especially his first wife, and love his son, and feels so culturally constrained that he can't show that to them. Um, it's just so tragic and so Shakespearean in a way, and it's such a beautifully layered character, and it also adds so much to, like, Spock later on when we see him again, and just,
Well,
it's just brilliance.
in terms of the relationship between Sarek and Spock, doesn't it sort of don't they sort of finally come together in at the end of the voyage home?
Yes, that's when he says, like, that's when Sarek finally acknowledges that, like, he may have been wrong in
Wrong
Spock,
about Spock joining Starfleet.
and he commends him on the people that he associates
Yes,
himself with. And Spock
right.
kind of derisively says, "Well, they're my friends." Um,
Your associates are of good character.
yes,
I
they're
think
my
is what he
friends.
said. Yes, they are
Um,
my friends.
you know, I think one thing that this also kind of hits home is that, like, if you have something that you need to say to your loved ones, you really shouldn't wait to say it. And
Yes, right.
maybe the real failure, we've talked about the failure of Klingons holding on to this notion of honor that is antiquated versus the real way people behave. I think the Vulcan experiment that we can say by watching this is a failure as well, because, like, these people are walking around in lives where they value each other, but they can't fully express how they value each
Well,
other.
since they repress or extirpate their emotions, then in terms of being able to communicate their love for another, as you just said, they suppress by suppressing the emotions, they suppress the ability to express love to others.
Do you know how I know that it's a failure too? Because if you see other characters in other series like T'Pol and Trip, T'Pol gets together with Trip is because Trip gets allows her to be open with her emotions. Because the entire T'Pol storyline is her being able to come to grips with her emotions, especially after she gets sick with one thing that, oh god, it was Tritium?
I can't.
She had
Yeah,
tritium poisoning or something.
yeah,
Something,
exactly.
but
Right.
it caused her to have this heightened emotional state. Um, it's basically shown that when Vulcans get together with humans or other people outside their species, they can form loving, emotional, you know, functional bonds. This entire idea that the Vulcan society has just kind of seems silly if you really think about it. Don't um, but on that note, I don't want to end this badly. I think that this is a great episode.
I do
Don't
too. Yeah, I thought it was
well
really good.
acted.
Yes.
Uh, you know, really well condensed and really well produced. I have to say.
Yeah,
Um,
I like the greetings, the farewell greetings between Picard and Sarek, where one says peace and long life. Picard says to Sarek, peace and long life. And in response, Sarek says to Picard, live long and prosper.
well, I'm glad you brought up that because I was going to have us end the episode that way. But there's one thing that Sarek says, and Captain Picard says back to him: "I will take my leave of you now, Captain. I do not think we shall meet again." "I hope you are wrong, Ambassador," says Captain Picard. "We shall always retain the best parts of the other inside us." "I believe I have gotten the better part of that bargain, Ambassador," Captain Picard says. "Peace and long life. Live long and prosper." It's such an interesting thing because Picard at the very beginning of the episode says, that he expresses his disappointment when it is initially said that Sarek is going to be in his quarters the entire trip. Because he's like, I want to have a chance to sit and talk and probe the mind of someone who was there and see what the real weight of it was forging the Federation. And Picard
Mm-hmm.
gets that, and he gets
Mm-hmm.
that fully. And he
Mm-hmm.
gets everything that he says he wanted that he was worried he wasn't going to get. And he gets it in a real way that matters. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that really captures this story. Good stories begin with an idea and answer that idea at the end. And the idea is
Mm-hmm.
that Picard wants to know who this guy really is and gets to find it in the most explicit, most intimate way possible. And I just think that that's brilliant
It
storytelling.
is. It is. Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
Dad, thank you so much for joining me as always. We don't have too many more episodes in this, but we have some great ones coming up. The next time we get together, we will be reviewing Menage a Troy, which is a great, fun episode. But Dad, I want to wish you good night and
Okay.
peace and long life.
Live long and prosper, my son.
Thanks, Dad. Good night.
All right. Bye.